Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma for our monthly webinar series. I'm Asia Mukes. I'm the Projects and Communications Manager here, and we're really excited about the expansion of the NCORE conference to this monthly series. Our hope is that we continue the conference's tradition of working to improve racial and ethnic relations on college campuses by providing virtual learning opportunities on effective strategies to enhance access, social development, education, communication, and cross-cultural understanding for traditionally underrepresented populations. I'm a little under the weather today. I'm going to try not to launch into a coughing fit. If I do, please forgive me. Registration has opened for our November webinar, Hashtags and Unfollows, Race and Racism in the World of Social Media, with Dr. Kevin Jen from Holy Names University and Dr. Alana Anderson from Babson College. The cost is $50, but we don't want the cost to complicate things. We still want you to have those webinar lunch and learns, so feel free to invite coworkers and students and other colleagues around your desk into the conference room or your auditoriums. Remember that our introductory webinar will be uploaded to YouTube and the NCORE webinar website. Our first two webinars are there now. After this month, the video will be emailed to those who registered. Make sure you're live posting. I've been checking Facebook and Twitter to see if folks are taking those pictures from their offices and from the auditoriums. Please post on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter with the hashtag NCORE and start the conversation online. Today we have Julie Alexander, who's the Access Consultant at Purdue University. Julie is primarily responsible for ensuring access for disabled students on campus. I just got a chat that the captioning isn't working. So we have a captioner on. I confirmed with her right before we started that the captions were available. Let's get through this and see if we can't fix that. Julie is primarily responsible for ensuring access for disabled students on campus. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Psychology in 2003 and her Master of Arts in Professional Counseling in 2007 from Central Michigan University. Prior to Purdue, Julie worked as an educational counselor at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan for 10 years. Through her work with students with disabilities, she became very passionate about working toward an educational environment that is welcoming and inclusive to students with diverse backgrounds and identities. Today, Julie will discuss different models of disability and highlight societal attitudes towards people with disabilities through media representation, messaging, and microaggressions. Finally, she will explore how higher education institutions can be more inclusive to people with disabilities. The Southwest Center is grateful for Julie's expertise and skill. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and start your video, Julie. And we thank you very much for your time today.
All right, thank you, Asia. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar today on Introduction to the Social Justice Models of Disability. My name is Julie Alexander. I'm an Access Consultant in the Disability Resource Center at Purdue University. And to start, I'd like to share a little bit about why it was important to me to do this webinar and why I specifically thought NCORE would be a good place. I've been to the NCORE conference a couple of times, and in talking to people about what it is that I do, I noticed that there appeared to be a lot of interest. and people seem to readily understand how disability fits in with the larger social justice picture. And as those of us working in the area of disability in higher education are seeking allies across campus, people who are already doing diversity work in other areas seem to be particularly good allies. I do want to make the disclaimer that I am not the expert here on disability. My knowledge in this area comes from my 10+ years work with this population, and through that I developed an interest in disability studies. And so I've done a lot of reading, and much of what I'm going to present today is based on the work of scholars in disability studies. So what I'm hoping to do today is to start a conversation that I hope will continue after this webinar. I hope that disabled voices are heard. I hope that disabled voices of color are heard. And by the way, you're hearing me say disabled. You'll hear me say disabled person. Later on in this webinar, I'm going to explain my intentional use of that language a little bit. So to start, I would like to right away start hearing from you. And what do you believe is the purpose of a disability resource center? So you can go ahead and raise your hand and we will call on somebody. So I'm thinking maybe there's no takers in answering that question. Okay. Well, what I will say is that
Hello.
Hi, Sammy.
Hi, it went out for a second.
No problem. All right, so what do you believe is the purpose of a disability resource center?
I believe the purpose of a disability resource center is to provide equitable educational opportunities for students who may need accommodations and access to different modes of learning modalities to best suit whatever their specific needs are, whether it's long-term, whether it's short-term, or whether it's psychological or physical or the other types of disabilities that exist.
Okay, that is an excellent wealth of thought out answer.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sammy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, so the Disability Resource Center, our main goal is access. Access to education, and Sammy gave a good description of that. But there are issues beyond access that are important to address as well. And so we're going to talk about that as we move forward with this webinar. So I want to start with some vocabulary that I think it's important that we're all on the same page with. So many times when you hear people talk about disability, they're referring specifically to the impairment. The impairment is the biological or psychological condition that is impacting a person's functioning. Now, this impairment, the relationship between that and what we're going to call disability is going to change depending on what model we're looking at. So a model is a simply way of conceptualizing or interacting with disability. And these different models that I'm going to present today, you'll notice some of them will contradict each other, and some of them will be complementary to each other. It's simply looking at disability through different lenses. Now, Melinda Hall talks about models as they're meant to symbolize or solve problems of exclusion and stigma for those with physical and mental difference. So that's what we'll be talking about today. So as I present these models, I'm presenting them in a chronological order, or at least what's believed to be the chronological order. I'm not giving exact dates or timelines because, especially with the early models, we're not exactly sure when they began. They also didn't die out. So these do not have end dates. They still exist. They coexist alongside of other models. So the first three models I'm going to talk about, I'm calling individual models. The reason for that is they locate disability within the individual. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So some of the earliest communications about disability, references to disability, comes out of religious scriptures. And so we call it the moral model, or sometimes it's referred to as the religious model. And so we'll talk about disability in some of these ancient texts. For example, there is a passage in the Bible in which the Pharisees asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind. So the assumption in that question, of course, is that disability is the result of sin, and that's simply taken for granted. And that's not unique to Judeo-Christian tradition. That's across the board, that disability was thought to be the result of some moral deficit. So a result of sin, a result of bad karma. Somebody did something wrong, and now the person is disabled. And as a result, they're seen as impure and excluded from religious ceremonies. So the moral model certainly intentionally excludes and says disabled people should not be a part of certain aspects of society. So moving on from that model, the charity model kind of evolved out of that as people started to take more of a benevolent view on disability. So instead of saying that disability is somebody's fault, instead now we're saying that disability is the result of tragedy. It's nobody's fault, but it is certainly sad and tragic that this person should be disabled. And because of that, now disabled people are objects of pity. They're people that we should feel sorry for. And they give us an opportunity to be nice to them or to be better people. So the reason that you would want to include disabled people in society is so that you get a secondary gain and can feel good about being a good person because you're compassionately, allowing them into society or being nice to them. This model has not gone away. You'll still see remnants of it, and particularly around awareness events. There are a lot of awareness events that focus on empathy or trying to get people to feel compassion toward disabled. So one type of awareness event that is really very popular is simulations. Simulations are where we try to give people the experience of what it's like to be disabled. So if a person is riding around in a wheelchair for a day, or if we give them a test to take and we switch some letters around to simulate dyslexia. The idea is to give people a taste of what it might be like to be disabled. The results, however, when we ask people, what did you get out of this? People tend to say, well, it was very, very hard. And I am so glad that I am not disabled. And so it creates more pity, more sympathy. And so disability activists, for that reason, tend to be against simulations as an awareness event. A lot of other awareness events maybe focus on what we might call a disability poster child, a sad figure of an innocent child that's disabled. A lot of fundraisers tend to use that. Or we might have the disabled person who's overcome their disability, so to speak, and they're objects of inspiration for people. Okay. So the medical model, what the medical model tries to do is get away from the emotional aspect of disability and try to look at it more objectively or clinically. And so now we're saying that disability is the result of pathology. It's a physical or mental illness. It's something wrong with the person that should be fixed if it can be. So in the medical model, the professional is the expert. So the medical profession, rehabilitation counselors, these are the people who know what it means to be disabled, they know what the person can and cannot do, and they know what the person needs. So kind of putting the medical professional or some professional in that role of expert. Like the other two models that we just talked about, the medical model sees disability as very much an individual problem. So the medical model certainly is not against including disabled people in society, wants to include disabled people in society. But in order to do that, we have to fix the person so that they fit. And we do that through cure or accommodation of some kind. Okay. So why the shift? These first models that we talked about, looking at disability in a very individual way. And at a certain point, we decided we need a new way of thinking about disability. In the United States, the disability rights movement, according to Joseph Shapiro, really begins with the story of one man, Ed Roberts. Ed Roberts contracted polio in 1953, and he entered UC Berkeley in 1962, which coincidentally is the same year that James Meredith, escorted by U.S. Marshals, integrated the University of Mississippi. But Roberts experienced a lot of barriers at UC Berkeley, and he had a long, hard fight for access. And he was able to join with others and kind of create a political movement at UC Berkeley. And then a decade later, in the 1970s, Roberts and others were involved in the 504 protest, which was, I think, probably the first big disability rights protest on a national level. And that was for the passing of certain regulations to end discrimination. And through that, the slogan was "Nothing about us without us." That slogan is directly responding to the medical model and the idea that the medical professional is the expert, or that other people, other professionals, need to be the ones to make decisions around disability. And so people really started to understand that we need to shift from the way we've always thought about disability, from the current paradigm, and we need a new way of thinking about disability at this point. So this is where we get the social models of disability. And they're called that because they locate disability not within the individual, but in the environment. So I want to talk a little bit about social construction, because this is important to the social models. You may be familiar with the concept of social construction from gender or race. The idea that these things are more of a social reality than they are a biological reality. And the same can be said about disability. So social justice, and I'm taking this from Amanda Krauss, who does a lot of speaking on social justice and disability. But a society is socially just when it can afford all groups full equal participation, equal access to resources, and in which all members are safe. So this is a goal that we're always striving for, but we also strive to be socially just in that process, and understanding that it may take us a while to get there. So the original social model or social justice model, sometimes it's referred to as the social justice models, very often just the social model, it comes to us out of Britain because they had a disability rights movement around the same time as the US movement, and they started to conceptualize disability differently. And how they did this is they said disability is not the impairment, it's something different. It is the social oppression that is caused when a person with an impairment enters into an environment that was not built for them. So if a wheelchair user comes into a building, they have a meeting on the second floor, they come to a flight of stairs and there's no elevator access, no ramp. So how do they get there? The individual models would say that the problem is that the person is in a chair. The social model says the problem is the stairs. So this is how disability is socially constructed. So it's not the impairment that's the disability, it's the inaccessible environment. And so now we're starting to look at disability not as an individual problem, but instead as a social problem. Okay, so this would be a good time to explain my language usage and how I'm talking about disability. So you may hear person with a disability a lot, and in many circles that's kind of generally accepted. But person with a disability actually fits much better with the individual models, because it's saying that the disability belongs to the person. When we say disabled person, what we mean is the environment is disabling to that person. So it is society that has disabled the person, not the condition. Rosemary Garland Thompson expresses this pretty well. So I have a quote of hers on screen, and she's talking about how it's the changing of her job and the use of computers in her job, the increasing use of computers in her job that left her increasingly disabled. So not that anything changed with her condition, but things changed with the demands of the job. So the social model in its original form is not without criticism from many disability scholars. And one of the chief criticisms of it is that it's dismissive of the bodily experience. So to say that disability is purely social oppression, it kind of ignores the fact that an impairment may cause pain, or it may cause poor health. And those are things that are disabling apart from the design of the environment. So impairment is not always neutral. Melinda Hall points out that the original social model never really made the claim that impairment was neutral, but it's certainly been taken that way, you know, if we're saying that the impairment is not what's disabling, then that's, in a way, I think, trying to say that it's neutral. Another criticism of the social model is that it is developed from a privileged perspective, and by that I mean it was white men in wheelchairs specifically, so not a very diverse view of disability or disability experience, and so because of that, it may miss some things. Now, when the social model came to the US at a time when people were starting to get pretty political around disability issues, it kind of evolved into what some call the minority model. And it's not that much different from the social model, except it's looking more through the lens of politics, whereas I think the social model is looking more through like the lens of sociology. I mean, it's kind of splitting hairs, but the minority model does accept the social definition of disability, that it's caused by the social oppression. It does see impairment as variation, and it sees people with impairments as a marginalized group of people, a minority. And so the focus through the minority model is on civil rights. If we can come together, like people started to do at UC Berkeley in the 60s, and then in San Francisco in the 70s, when we come together, we have power. And so some of the things that disabled people have fought for is education, employment, direct funding for personal assistance. So that's where instead of the government hiring assistance for people, they would give the money to the disabled person, and then they can hire their own assistants, giving the person more autonomy. And then the fight for equal access to public transportation has been a long, hard fight. Progress has been made, but more progress probably still needs to come. And the minority model begins to look at the problem of stigma around disability, and how do we create a positive disability identity. So some of the criticisms of the minority model that people have pointed out, one is that disability is a very fluid category, and sometimes that makes it hard for people to join together in a really strong way. There's a lot of different types of disabled experience out there. And sometimes people feel more disabled one day and less the next, depending on the type of condition. So how strongly they identify as a disabled person might change. And some see the minority model in claiming that disabled people are a minority. That can be seen as, well, you know, are you taking resources from other minorities? And maybe putting disability against those groups. The cultural model has kind of evolved out of these. It's something that Snyder and Mitchell started talking about in 2006. And it defines disability as sometimes biological, very often social. But its chief concern isn't necessarily how do we define disability, but more what do we do with it. The cultural model kind of picks up where the minority model begins talking about identity, and the cultural model says, you know, how do we develop that identity? And they say experiential forms of expression. And this would be through film, art, literature, personal narratives. So instead of looking at research about disability, you know, what do disabled people have to say about their own experience? And through this, yeah, and through cultivating disability art, can people come together and start building those strong identities and replacing stigma with a strong positive identity. So that's what the cultural model is really attempting to do. Now at this point, I'd like to give you a quick opportunity to reflect a little bit. And how does your campus view disability? And yeah, can you think of any specific examples that fit into any of these models that have been presented? Certainly there's probably not just one model that is the official model, but you might see evidence of all 6 of these at times. So I'm going to shut off my camera for about 5 minutes and mute myself, so you can, if you are in a room with other people, you can converse for about 5 minutes, and then we will come back together shortly. Okay. If anybody wants to share a little bit about what they thought about or what they discussed, if you want to raise your hand, we can call on somebody. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue, but hopefully you had a chance to discuss that a little bit. Okay, so I want to talk about attitudinal barriers and some of the things that disabled people might be experiencing. So first of all, talking about what is ableism. And actually disableism is something a little bit different, similar, but a little bit different from ableism. And it is an overtly negative or hostile attitude toward disability. So when somebody makes a comment like, well, we don't have a lot of disabled students in our program because our program is very rigorous, that would be disableism. They're making the statement that disabled people wouldn't be able to get through that program. Ableism is a little more subtle and it happens a lot more with very well-meaning people. And it's more of being oblivious to disability issues. Or when you fail to turn on captioning, or the website is inaccessible for those who use screen readers, or having a presentation in a room that lacks wheelchair access. You know, all of those things would be examples of ableism. They don't necessarily come from a place of malice or hostile intention, but simply a lack of awareness most of the time. So you may be familiar with the term microaggression, kind of the backhanded compliments or the everyday snubs that people get. One example might be when somebody says to an African American that they're very articulate. So the expectation then is that they wouldn't be articulate, and so for that reason it's a microaggression. Keller and Galgay came up with a list of microaggressions that are specific to disability. One very common one is a denial of personal identity. So when somebody makes a comment such as, oh, I had no idea you were married, in a very surprised way, it could be that they didn't think that a disabled person would have romantic relationships, or don't think of them as being a person outside of being disabled. On the flip side of that is the denial of disability experience. So in higher education, we're seeing a very high increase in anxiety and depression. And sometimes people will say, you know, in a very well-meaning way, well, we all get nervous before an exam, or we all have times when we're down and we can't get out of bed. That's kind of minimizing the experience that that person is having. So that can also be a microaggression. Denial of privacy, often when a disability is visible and people are aware of it, they might ask questions like, what happened to you? not realizing that a person may not want to talk about that, and that could be private. With the charity model, we talked about, the secondary gain that we get when we try to help others or, want to help others. And it's not that helping is a bad thing, but when we go so far as to make the person feel helpless. So, if you're in close proximity to somebody and you see that they're struggling and you can hold the door, that might be a kind gesture. But if you run across the room, to make sure you're there when they're perfectly capable of getting the door, then that might be making the person feel helpless. One peculiar kind of phenomena is something called spread effect. And that's where people will sometimes assume that if one disability is present, that there are multiple. So, for example, if somebody has a speech impediment and people assume that they're unintelligent or that there's an intellectual disability that goes along with that, we would call that spread effect. Patronization, infantilization of disabled people. So treating disabled people as though they were children happens fairly often, kind of speaking to them in a childlike voice, a high-pitched voice or something. One thing that happens sometimes when we try to provide access is we inadvertently treat people as second-class citizens. Just the fact that people need to come to a separate office to request to be included in an environment that doesn't already include them, that right there is kind of second-class citizenship. But also when we do things like the accessible entrance is in the back of the building where we take the trash in and out, that also would be an example of treating people as second-class citizens. The desexualization, I kind of alluded to that earlier with the denial of personal identity, but it's the idea that disabled people don't have sex or shouldn't have sex or should only have sex with other disabled people. So that is a common view as well. I want to talk a little bit about film and stereotype, and one of the reasons that I think it's important to pay attention to disabled characters in film and media is because, number one, they're underrepresented. So the narratives that are present are particularly salient because of that. I would recommend, if you are on YouTube, to maybe search for Annie Elaney. She has a YouTube channel and she speaks about this in a rather entertaining way. But she talks about underrepresentation of disabled characters. She talks specifically about underrepresentation of disabled characters of color. And she talks about a lot of other issues as well. So I highly recommend her. Farnell and Smith did some research, this back in the late 90s, but looking at why it's so important to pay attention to these narratives is because what people see in film and on television really does impact the perceptions that they have of disabled people, which is the same with other identities and populations as well. But they found that it's even more, it has even more of an impact than when you actually know a disabled person, which I found interesting and a little concerning. because Black and Smith, almost a decade later, did some work looking at what are some themes, what are these narratives that we often see disabled characters falling into. And I think it's important to look at those and pay attention to those and how they're affecting society. Probably one of the most common, certainly one of the oldest, is the pitiable and pathetic stereotype. So this would be kind of like the Tiny Tim. Usually these disabled characters are not the main character, but is somebody who's there to help the main character become a better person. So they feel sorry for them. It tugs at our heartstrings. So we see that a lot. On the flip side of that is something that the literature calls super crip. And a super crip is a person who has extraordinary abilities that, in a sense, make up for being disabled. And so one example, there's a TV show, I believe it's called The Good Doctor, and it's about a doctor who is autistic. And this doctor is highly, highly intelligent, a savant-like intelligence, and so it kind of makes up for the perceived deficits. The problem with this, although some see it as positive, because it's getting away from the pitiable and pathetic stereotype, but the problem with it is that it creates what some call the super crip imperative. Eli Clare talks about their own experiences with this. So it's the idea that they have to overcome in order to be equal, in order to be accepted in society, in order for the disability to be okay. I must be better than other people in some way. So the super crip can be damaging as well. Another stereotype is the sinister, evil, or cunning, the disabled villain stereotype. And there's a new movie coming out, M. Night Shyamalan, Glass, and there are two disabled villains, at least, in that movie. And what's important about that is that these are not villains that happen to be disabled. The backstory makes it very clear that it is the disability that causes the moral deficit. So they're very bitter. They want people to suffer because they have suffered. And so this is a rather dangerous stereotype. Another narrative that we see a lot in films around disability is the idea that that some disabled people might be better off dead. Movies like Me Before You kind of romanticize the suicide of the main disabled character. It kind of making that, okay. And it's important to look at how does that affect actual disabled people, and how triggering can that be? So, something to think about. Kind of a lesser version of the disabled villain is the maladjusted disabled person, usually a newly disabled person who's their own worst enemy, and oftentimes it's through the help of a kind non-disabled main character that they come to accept themselves and their new way of being. There are some movies around disability that focus on the family or others, and what a burden the disabled person is, or how good they are for taking care of this person. So that kind of feeds into the better off dead theme as well, when people start thinking that they're a burden to others. And then the idea that disabled people are unable to live a successful life. The movie $1 Million Baby, Hilary Swank's character at one point is a successful boxer, and then she becomes injured and her life is essentially over. And that fits in with the better off dead, as well. So these stereotypes kind of fit together, blend together quite a bit. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talking about intersectionality. And there is a lot of literature and scholars who are looking at the intersection of gender and disability, the intersection of LGBTQ plus identity and disability. Because of time and scope, I chose in this webinar to talk specifically about the intersection of race and disability, and particularly in education. So will be kind of a brief discussion about that. Okay, so on the screen here I have a definition of intersectionality that comes from Anna McConnor and Ferry from their 2016 book, Discrit, Disability Studies and Critical Race Theory in Education. And so they're looking at, how do these different identities intersect? How are they interrelated in different time and different places? And of course, they're looking, specifically at how does disability and race intersect in education. The thing that's talked about probably the most in research, particularly around education, is the overrepresentation of students of color in special education. So students of color are labeled as disabled far more often than white students, particularly African American students are more likely to be labeled intellectually disabled, emotionally disabled, or learning disabled. But also, we do see Latinx, Native American students, Native Alaskan students are also disproportionately labeled. And a reason for this, it's been speculated at least, is certainly bias. Perhaps bias of teachers who are pulling students out for assessment, and bias of those who are doing the assessment. Now, this overrepresentation is significantly less in sensory or physical categories. Although Rothstein, in his 2017 book, Color of the Law, talks about higher cases of asthma in African American populations, and how that's affected attendance at school, and it has been seen as contributing to the achievement gap. The reason, according to Rothstein, that there are higher cases of asthma and other respiratory diseases, other chronic illnesses, is because commercial waste treatment facilities or uncontrolled waste dumps are more likely to be found near African American than white residential areas. So when we talk about the social construction of disability, most of the time we're talking about how the design of the environment creates a disadvantage for those with impairments. But also, what often happens is we create an environment that creates impairment. And that is done in socially unjust ways. So another example would be Flint, Michigan. You have a predominantly African-American community, and the water is contaminated, and that's going to lead to higher rates of disability in that community. So apart from the labeling, students of color often have a different experience of disability than do white students, in that they are more likely to be placed in special education, whereas white students with the same label, the same condition, are more likely to be mainstreamed. So as a result, disabled students of color are less likely to go to college than are the white students. So we've seen in higher education in recent years a pretty big increase of learning disabled students coming to college. And most of those students tend to be white with family incomes of over $100,000 per year. So there's definitely a disconnect and definitely an unequitable experience there. So I'd like to give you another 5 minutes to reflect or to talk with others. What I just talked about had a lot to do with education in K through 12. And there's definitely scholarly interest in the experience of disabled students of color in college, but I haven't seen a lot published on that yet. But I would like to hear from you, and I'll give you, 5 minutes to talk amongst each other. And if anybody wants to share, I would very much love to hear a response. What might be some barriers that disabled students of color would experience in higher education specifically? So it'll take about 5 minutes here. Okay, so any thoughts on that?
Julie, we might be nearing our time for questions, but Rosemary looks like she has a question.
Okay.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi, how are you?
Good. You have some discussion ideas?
Yeah, this is my first time using Zoom and I thought I just deleted you guys. Sorry about that. So I was just going to respond to your question about the barriers for students in higher ed. So I was just going to chime in that touching on what Julie said earlier is that, you know, not only do you have somebody that is maybe has different barriers and challenges, but when you add the minority component and they go into an office where there's not someone that either has the same disability or even any disability, and then they also add the component of a different background, different experiences, they might have difficulty connecting with that person who is there to try to help them. There might be trust issues. There's a lot of different components that might be going on in that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And particularly at, you know, predominantly white institutions like Purdue is, you know, we don't have a very, you know, racially diverse staff. We have a staff that's diverse in other ways, but not racially diverse. And so that can be a barrier. I also think it, self-disclosing, saying, you know, I am disabled or I need some assistance requires a certain level of trust. And so there can certainly be some barriers there. Thank you, that's a good point. Okay.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Okay.
So Rebecca Treywick says that students may have a huge lack of race-based community and cultural connections if student populations of color are entering higher ed at smaller rates than Black students. She also said they may enter higher ed with greater academic challenges than white peers who are mainstream, and depends on levels of rigor in special ed programs versus resources allocated to white mainstream students.
Yeah, that's that could very well be a barrier. Yeah, because of the difference in the experience in K through 12 and disabled students being treated different, disabled students of color being treated different from white disabled students. Yeah, definitely that's going to, if they are coming into higher education, that's going to create more barriers for sure.
So I want to go up really quickly to some of the questions that were asked in the chat. Jay Guerra said, we were discussing the use of simulations as a potential agent of change, not necessarily for pity, but towards compassion and empathy if done in a way that provokes thought, discussion, and potential change. For instance, having students blindfolded, experiencing using a wheelchair. You mentioned that simulations are not the best option for us to use. Do you believe there's merit to employing them at all?
Well, there's definitely different opinions on that. I know when I was at Ferris, we had an intern who was a chair user herself, and she believed very strongly in simulations. So there are certainly different opinions on that. I do know that there are quite a few in the disability community that are pretty strongly and adamantly against them, and believe that there are, you know, other ways to have that dialogue or raise that awareness. So it's certainly a discussion, you know, worth having.
Perhaps maybe a strategy could be to talk to disabled persons on your campus, engage them in a conversation of kind of how to build awareness and whether or not that would work on your campus and with the community of people on your campus.
Mhm.
Rebecca also asked, who did the research in the 90s on the portrayals of disability related to perception?
I believe that was Farnell and Smith. And if you have the PowerPoint presentation, all of the references are cited in there. So you'll have the article and the journal and all of that to look that up.
I'm not sure if LaDonna left, but she had a question and I don't see it anymore in the chat. So LaDonna, if you are still there, then put your question back in the chat and then we can answer. So Julie, I'll let you finish your presentation. I know you have a couple more slides and then we can have a hardcore Q&A session if folks have questions.
Okay, great, sounds good. Okay, so I'm happy to get to disability in higher education. And this section is mostly reflecting the work of Jay Delmage in his book, Academic Ableism. So we talked a little bit earlier about ableism and disableism. Delmage says that academia is very much rooted in both ableism and disableism. And so we have a legacy of that that we're trying to undo. Disabled students are less likely to earn their degree. According to Delmage, 13% of disabled people over the age of 25 have a college degree compared to 31% of non-disabled people. So there's certainly a disparity there. The National Center for Students with Disabilities said that, their research showed that disabled students are significantly less comfortable in class, less comfortable in their academic departments and on the campus as a whole than are their non-disabled peers. Delmage also talks about how severely underfunded most disability offices are. So the average disability office is about 1/6, the annual budget is about 1/6 that of the annual salary of a US college football coach, which kind of says something about priorities. But that's, causes some significant barriers there. Delmage also talks about the severe lack of disabled faculty. The statistic that he cited was 3.6% of tenured faculty were disabled. And so much like in other with other identities, when we don't see, examples of people who share similar experiences in positions of authority, then it, has an impact. Okay, so what do we do about it? The National Center for Students with Disabilities has talked about some strategies for improvement. One is, looking at what you're doing on your campus and how well that's working. So including disability in campus climate surveys, assessing disability services and supports, and overall campus accessibility would be a great start. Also learning about disability. On many campuses, I won't say all, but on many campuses, the only people that talk about disability or expected to know anything about disability are the people in the disability office. And since we're doing a lot of stuff to ensure access, that means we might not be doing as much cultural stuff as we'd want to. So maybe partnering with others to develop faculty and staff training programs, including disability and student orientation programming, and creating multiple centers of expertise on your campus with regard to disability. Also, campus-wide engagement kind of right along with that, supporting and encouraging student organizations that have some relationship to disability. Maybe, if there's not a lot of disabled faculty and staff, maybe including the disabled faculty and staff in recruitment and retention efforts. And looking at inclusive pedagogy, working with a faculty center or a center for instructional excellence. These would be great places to start talking more about disability. Okay, so one last question, if anybody wants to raise their hand. Is there anything that you might do, anything that you've thought about today that you might want to implement to make your campus more inclusive of disabled students?
Anyone? Raise your hand. So Cammie said create more trainings.
Okay, great. Always a cool thing to do.
If I can, Cammie had a question. It says, how do you appropriately address the disparities in higher ed with leadership?
How to appropriately address the disparities addressing with leadership, the disparities of disabled students. Is that?
Cammie, is that? Yes.
Okay. With persistence, I would say it's, messages that they'll have to hear over and over. And anytime that you can have data to back that up, I think that people are more likely to listen. So collecting data from your students about the things that they are experiencing and the barriers that are in place. I think that's very helpful when going to administration, to talk about these are some barriers that we really need to address.
So we have another question. It says, can you share what you've done on your campus, some best practices that you've engaged in?
Yeah, so we have tried to, at Purdue, move to more of a social model. So looking at both the original social model, the minority model, the cultural model, in the way that we work with students. So we've made some changes in the Disability Resource Center to be more welcoming for students and more open to work with them. Some of that is lightening up on documentation and things like that, in an attempt to be more open, changing some of the language that we use. But one thing that we've done this year is we started a disability culture series, a lecture discussion series. The first one was kind of sort of like this webinar a little bit, just kind of an introduction to disability as an aspect of diversity, and talking about microaggressions. We had one just last week on deaf culture specifically. We'll have one next week on mental illness. And so we're trying to, create more dialogue campus-wide around disability issues. Another thing that we did last year was a photo voice project, and we engaged our student group in this. And they went around campus taking pictures of barriers. So, you know, if it was maybe a restaurant that didn't have menus, but only had like the visual display that some people couldn't see, taking a picture of that with a caption explaining why it's a barrier. And that was pretty well received. We had a lot of people, particularly from like facilities, from campus police, you know, a lot of people who were interested and engaged and said, you know, I never realized that this was a barrier before. So anything, you know, that you can do to kind of highlight on campus, make the campus more aware, you know, it's been pretty well received here. We've had good attendance for our culture series, so I've been excited about that.
So we have just about 10 minutes or so left. Are there any other questions from participants? I have both the chat box and the Q&A box up, so feel free to ask questions in either one. I have a question for you, Julie.
Yeah.
What is the future of what you see as disability resources on campuses?
Oh, that's a great question. And I kind of started with, you know, what do you believe is the role, you know, of a disability resource center? And many times the role, at least right now, is, you know, ensuring access and trying to eliminate the barriers. What I would like to see that evolve into is maybe looking more like a cultural center in the future, where people don't have to ask for access as much because it's built in. And then we can focus more on creating a positive or fostering a positive identity, doing more cultural events, educating more about the history of disability rights, doing more things around disability studies. So yeah, I see the future as cultural.
So Julie, I apologize. I was sitting back in the chair and I realized I have to get close and for folks to hear me. So the question was, what does Julie see as the future of the purpose of the disability resource centers on college campuses?
Yeah. Yeah, so again, I'd like to see our purpose evolve from being simply about access to being about helping to foster identity, because a lot of students come into college without a strong sense of what it means to be disabled, maybe in a positive way. You know, it's usually thought of as something that's devalued, it's something that's stigmatized and maybe needs to be hidden. So I'd like to see disability resource centers become more about fostering a sense of pride in that disability identity.
Sorry, I was told that my microphone was really, really quiet, so I'm trying to get close so people can hear me. I apologize. I also have something going on with my throat, so I can't talk as loud as I usually do. Are there any other questions for Julie? I know it's fall and the weather is changing, and that could make some folks a little tired toward the end of the day.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, do you want to wrap up your presentation, Julie?
Sure. I just want to thank everybody. It means a lot to me that you joined this webinar today, and thank you very much for your interest in this topic and looking at disability as a part of diversity. You should have been sent the PowerPoint slides. I'm just kind of showing the references on here really quickly. And, you know, I want to thank NCORE for giving me this opportunity. And Asia, thank you so much for all of your help and support leading up to the webinar. And it's been a great experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We really appreciate you. We cannot wait to see everyone at NCORE 2019 in Portland, Oregon. If you are interested and you think your institution might be interested in sponsorship of NCORE, please send me an email. We are actively seeking sponsorship for the conference. My email address is ajiameux@ou.edu. Thank you again for your participation. Our webinar for November is open. It's only $50 and you can have as many people in the room as you want. Again, it's hashtags and unfollows, racism in the age of social media. So thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful day.